Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly Ash. I'm the senior researcher at the Center for Rural Policy and Development. We just released our State of Rural in Minnesota report that we do every year. It really is a demographic and economic data dump, just to kind of give a window into some of the trends that are occurring in rural Minnesota. But I'm going to give a quick presentation of some of the highlights, give you a little bit more detail in case you don't want to read the full report or you want some more context. Hope to provide it here. For those of you unfamiliar with the Center for Rural Policy and Development, we are a nonpartisan, not-for-profit policy research organization. We really do just kind of highlight trends. We dig in as well into deeper issues, a whole breadth of issues in economic development, anywhere from housing to looking at trends in nursing home availability to mental health access, healthcare access. We've done a lot of different topics. And again, it's nonpartisan, and we really just focus on rural Minnesota and kind of highlighting some of the main issues that are occurring here. So I'm going to give a lot of charts because that's what the state of rural is. Like I said, it's a bit of a data dump. And so bear with me as we kind of break some of this down. You're going to see a lot of charts that breaks Minnesota down into 4 different categories. We have entirely rural, town-rural mix, urban town-rural mix, and entirely urban. These are categorized using the rural-urban commuting area geographies developed by the USDA and then further aggregated by our state demographer here in Minnesota, who came up with these 4 categories. A really fantastic way to look at it. We feel like it kind of gives a nice breadth of rurality versus urban, as well as not having too many categories that kind of dilutes the key messages and trends. So that's what we're going to be using for a lot of this. You might see some planning region breakdowns as well, but this is majority of what we're going to be using. So let's start with people. Aging populations in rural areas impacting natural population change. And this is kind of the long-term trend that all of Minnesota is going to be facing, and rural areas in particular are feeling it particularly severely right now. So these are the components of natural population change. You have births, the number of deaths, and then the sum of those is the natural change. So let's start with entirely rural areas. And what you're starting to see here is entirely rural areas has always had a few more deaths than births. So that has had a negative consequence on population change, right? So if you're having more deaths than births, then there's less people being added to your area. And you can see, the gap was, a pretty minimal, but what you've seen since 2017 is an increase in that. And that's due to a couple factors. One is we have an aging population. The baby boomer generation, a rather large group of people, are approaching that time in their life where they're starting to pass away a little bit. Illnesses are taking effect. And so we expect over the next 20 years for this to continue to increase, that this will be the trend. On top of this is just kind of either a stagnant or declining birth rate, particularly in rural areas. And so what this has led to is a widening gap between many more deaths than births. And so that's why you're seeing that. And that's something that rural areas are going to be looking or facing over the next 20 years. Town-rural mix, similar, right? Had been having a few more births than deaths. So have had population change, positive population change in our natural components of natural population change. But you could see starting in 2020, that split happened. And so now they're facing a few more deaths than births. And again, we don't expect this trend to change. Same for urban, town, rural, right? So it used to be quite a few more births than deaths, and all of a sudden they've now slammed together. And so they're essentially balancing out. In our entirely urban areas, a lot more births than deaths. But again, you're starting to see an upward trend of deaths. And so urban areas are going to face this as well. While at the same time, births is relatively stagnant, if not slightly declining. So this is the ongoing trend, particularly severe in rural areas, not as severe in urban areas, but it is the trend that all of Minnesota is going to be facing. Fortunately, something interesting that's going on, particularly for rural areas that's more positive, is a shift in migration for our rural counties. So I know these charts are kind of zigzag and they go up and down kind of crazy, but kind of look at the trends here. If we look at entirely rural counties, this black line is the net migration. So looking at international and domestic migration. This dark blue line is domestic migration. They pretty much match. And then international migration for our entirely rural areas has been minimal, right? So like 75 people internationally migrated to our entirely rural counties in 2023, sorry. What's interesting here, though, is the domestic migration. That's something a lot of people have been talking about, particularly since the pandemic. And you can see from 2000 to 2010, despite the up and down, there was a pretty stagnant or even declining domestic migration, meaning they're having more people domestically leave their counties than coming in. But since 2015, 2017, it's been on a little bit of an upward trajectory. Like we've really started to see that trend. 2017 was a particularly good year where we actually had in our entirely rural counties a positive domestic migration, so a net in migration. And that has continued, even though there's been some up and down. We're still seeing that nice upward trajectory. So that's the trend line in entirely rural areas. That's been something that's really interesting to see and a pretty positive thing. The same in town rural mix, a very similar trend. They had been seeing declines in domestic migration, so essentially a net out migration domestically. But then since like that kind of 2015, 2017, it's really been an upward trajectory. Urban town rural mix, exact same thing, right? Had been declining pretty significantly up until about 2012 there. And then now we're starting to see an upward migration or upward trend in that migration. So these are really positive trends. Interestingly, our entirely urban areas had been pretty kind of just static. They've been up and down. I think a lot of folks always think our entirely urban areas just constantly see net in migration domestically, but that hasn't actually been the case. This is Minnesota. We're in the Frost Belt. As a state, we don't do great in migration. We just don't. Much of the Frost Belt doesn't. So that includes North Dakota, South Dakota, Wisconsin, and Iowa. Minnesota is no different. And so you could see in our entirely urban areas, there was some upward trend line in net domestic in migration. And in 2017, it really started to come down quite a bit, really plummeted quite a bit during the pandemic. But it's starting to recover to kind of where it was pre-pandemic. Again, not great trends for our urban areas, but at least improvement from the pandemic. So that's what's been going on. That's a really interesting shift in trends. We don't usually see that very often. So that's interesting to see. So due to this, although we have more deaths than births in our most rural areas, but this kind of nice in-migration that we're starting to see means that a lot of rural counties are seeing some positive population gains so far this decade or so far since 2020. So this looks at what counties had less population in 2019 than they did in 2010. You can see quite a few counties here. It was 46 counties in all had lower population in 2019 than in 2010. That's quite a few. But so far this decade, we're seeing a really interesting turnaround, particularly in the southern half of Minnesota, but also places in northern Minnesota, where so far in 2023, they have a higher population than they did in 2020. So again, some interesting trends happening here. A little bit different than what we saw last decade. It's only 3 years in this decade, so we'll see if the trend continues. But some good positive news there, along with the kind of more negative trend lines with the amount of deaths we're going to be seeing. BIPOC populations, so our Black, Indigenous, and persons of color populations continue to grow in rural areas. Again, I think sometimes that gets overlooked, but some of the most diverse populations in Minnesota reside in greater Minnesota. So you could really see 1980 to 2023, a lot more growth. Lots of rural Minnesota has more than 15% of its population that is Black, Indigenous, or a person of color. Really interesting to see. One thing I didn't include here, but if you look at the report, you can really compare if these kind of concentrations where there's larger populations or a higher percentage of populations that are BIPOC, those particular counties looking out to 2030, 2035, and 2040 are expected to continue or are projected to grow in population throughout the next couple of decades, whereas a lot of these other counties that have lower percentages of BIPOC populations are not projected to grow, again, due to kind of, minimal migration. Even though it's positive, it isn't a lot of people, but we have those increasing deaths that are going to occur. When you have BIPOC populations, you tend to see a lot more in-migration as well as birth rates go up as well. And so that's what really contributes to their positive projections moving forward. And then the one thing that tends to get overlooked, maybe a lot of folks in rural Minnesota know about this, Ben Winchester's work around 30 to 49-year-olds. We talk a lot about 18 to 29-year-olds leaving our rural counties, which does happen. But we talk a lot less about the age groups that tend to migrate into our rural areas. And that's going to be the 30. I have 30 to 34 here, but really 30 to 49 is when we tend to see a lot more folks in migrating to our rural areas. This is 2000 to 2010 data. That 2020 data is a little bit elusive right now due to the decennial census being a little bit more problematic than usual. And so still kind of waiting to see how that all teases out a little bit. But it's a trend that we don't see going away. This is kind of something that's been happening since actually the 1970s. Getting more into the economic side of things, earnings in wages in rural areas tend to be talked about a lot in terms of them being lower than our urban areas. Here we're taking a look at that. On the left-hand side, you can see earnings per capita. So earnings includes not only wages people earn, but also, interest rates, revenue from businesses, dividends, things like that. So it includes a broader swath, rent income as well. We like to use that because in rural areas, there tends to be a lot more variation in sources of income. So it may not just be a wage, but rather a lot of different sources of income that isn't typically captured in the median wage data that you tend to see published. So here we're using earnings. And despite trying to capture a broader swath of income sources, you can see still a pretty significant gap in earnings per capita between our entirely urban counties versus our other types of county groups. So, if we have this gap, what you want to see is that in order to close that gap, you got to see higher growth. And interestingly, that's really what we see. Earnings per capita, if we look at the index, so essentially how much has it changed since 2001? And you can see by 2023, our entirely rural areas have actually seen 153% growth in their earnings, 135% for our town rural mix, 124% for our urban town rural mix county group, and then 110% for our entirely urban. So this is good to see. So even though we see this persistent gap in earnings, at least we're seeing growth outpace our urban areas. So at least we can keep that gap where it is, if not close it just a little bit. So to me, bad news, the gap still persists. Good news is that we're still continuing to see growth. That to me really still speaks to some pretty healthy economy in our rural areas of Minnesota. Not every place is perfect, but at the aggregate level, this is good to see. Education and health services are the dominant employment industry across Minnesota. And I'll make a quick note here for those of you that have followed State of Rural in years previous. We used to take a lot of pride on being able to capture particular industries that data does not account for very well. So most data only looks at people that qualify for unemployment insurance. So very typical jobs. Jobs that, for example, like farm hands, people that are in farming and things like that, or some of the extractive industries, such as timber, or if you own your own non-employer, things like that, they don't get captured as being employed in typical employment data. And so we used to use the Bureau of Economic Analysis as a data source to really try and get some of those other types of industries better represented. Unfortunately, that data has been discontinued. So we don't have access to it. So the following data is going to look a little bit different than previous years. Those trend lines that we saw, I had to replace the data. So it's different trend lines now, and they really do undercount those types of, I'm just going to use farming as an example, but there are other industries that are going to be undercounted here. So if you're wondering why more, agricultural linked counties don't have higher employment, let's say in agriculture, it's because they're not being well captured. So I just want to put that out there. Despite that, I will say educational services and healthcare and social assistance, typically, even if we had the better data that accounted for the industries better, still would be the most prominent industry sector across all of Minnesota, urban, rural, it doesn't really matter. There's a few others here. You can see manufacturing pops up across Minnesota, as well as arts, entertainment, recreation, that's tourism up in Cook County, and then wholesale trade. So that's pretty typical of what you see in a rural area. The next slide here kind of looks at what we really do see in the top 5. So not just the first, the most top employment. And it really, in rural areas, is that trade, transportation, utilities, leisure, and hospitality. So that's at arts and recreation, manufacturing, construction, resource extraction, which includes agriculture and fishing and hunting, things like that, as well as professional and business services. That usually rounds out the top 5 across all of Minnesota. There isn't a whole lot of variation in terms of what the top 5 is composed of, but there can be some variation in what's number 2 versus number 5, depending on which region of the state you're in. Rural areas have a higher percentage of workers employed in government or as sole proprietors. So one thing that's kind of interesting is if we take a look at the number of jobs that are in each of these sectors, so the percentage of jobs in government is always significantly higher in our rural areas. You can see up near 16% by 2023 in our entirely rural areas, where our most urban counties, it's only closer to 10%. And then these non-employer self-employed, some people call them 1099ers, you can see significantly higher in our rural counties versus our urban counties, about 10% more. It's kind of interesting. I think for a lot of folks, it's kind of interesting to see, what types of jobs people might be working for. This might look at different economic development, and non-employers and self-employed are a little bit hard to capture in terms of what are they doing? What's the industry they're in? How much are they making? The data is a little bit harder to find. And so as an economic development professional in a rural area, it's something to kind of take a look at, to think about as you're making any plans. And if you know anybody that is a non-employer, really sit down and chat with them and get to know them. Try and figure out, what types of services might they need that might differ from a typical employer-based industry or business. Wages meeting the cost of living, that's varying significantly across Minnesota. For those of you that have been following State of Rural for previous years, you may have noticed that, usually wages, particularly in rural areas, even despite them being lower, would make up a significant percentage of the cost of living because the cost of living was cheaper, particularly housing. Was the biggest one, but that has really changed over the past few years. And so it's not as robust. And so you can see here median wages as a percent of the cost of living, 2023. This data for cost of living, it's accounting for 1.5 workers in a household. So somebody working full-time, one person working part-time with one child. That's kind of what we use. You can vary it as, the percentages are going to change, but the degree between areas isn't going to change much. But you will see that in our rural areas, about 125 to 150%, that's what the median wage will make up for the cost of living. I used to be better than that. It's no longer that way. And then you can see really in the Central Lakes in northern, north of the 7-county Twin Cities metropolitan area, less than 125%. There's some counties in here that are 80%, where the median wage is not, for 1.5 workers, is not meeting the cost of living. So anybody that's in these areas, any professionals, economic development areas, this is something to kind of take a look at, to think about, to consider. You might be having some issues there in terms of wages being able to make up the cost of living. And again, one of the biggest reasons we've seen some of these changes is the cost of housing and the cost of food. Those two things have really impacted people's ability to meet the cost of living on median wages. Greater Minnesota feeling pressure to fill job vacancies. I'm sure I'm talking to everybody that already knows this, but this is a big deal. Continues to be a big deal. Here you're looking at the job vacancy rate. So that's the job vacancies as a percent of total employment. And you can see it really spiked in 2021. We had rates up near 10% in northern Minnesota. It has decreased. This is 2022 data now. It has decreased some, but still pretty high. You could see in also outside of the 7-county metro, it's actually higher than the 7-county metro. The metro here is at 4.6%, the highest in Northeast at 6.6%. Pretty happy to see it come down a little bit. That was pretty important. 10% is unreasonable. And you would be hard pressed to find any employer that would want to come and move in or try to expand and grow in an area that has 10% job vacancy rate. We like to see 3 to 4.5% job vacancy rate. That can be pretty healthy because you have opportunities then, but hopefully employers also have a labor pool to work with. So again, we're still up above the what we would consider the healthy range. I don't know if that's going to change. I think we're going to be up here around 6-7% for years to come, just with the demographic situation that we're in. So don't expect this to continue to improve, I guess is what I'm trying to say. One interesting thing, obviously, when you have a worker shortage, one positive thing that always comes out is you see increases in wages, and we have definitely seen that. This is a smooth line. If I use the actual lines, it's a lot more jagged, but these are the general trend lines, and you can see there used to be a significant gap between the 7-county metro and the other regions in the median wages of job vacancies. That wage really closed up until about 2016, and this was due to our rural regions feeling job vacancies a lot more harshly before the 7-county metro felt it. And so by 2017, 7-county metro really started to feel a pinch in jobs, in workforce. And so their wages really started to increase there too. So yeah, seeing really healthy growth across the board. The gap between regions is pretty minimal, which is great to see. So employers, I feel like are trying to do the best they can and to respond to the labor force shortage. But you can only increase wages so long before it really starts to impact businesses' ability to make profits. So be interesting to see how this continues to shake out over the coming years. Thanks a lot, everybody. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to call us or email us. We're always available. We get back to you pretty quickly. And if you have any questions or want me to come and present to your group, either State of Rural or other issues we're working on, feel free to reach out. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.